Hi, I'm Othais, and this is also a reproduction of Colt's improved model holster pistol, later known as the Old Model Army Revolver, sometimes called the Dragoon. Many consider this to be a third model Dragoon. They are wrong. You will find out why by the end of the episode. But first, the light box. A lot of these numbers should feel familiar because once again we have an overall length of 14 1/4 inch and a weight of 4.1 pounds, although if you were to look very carefully beyond where we round our errors, this has a fraction of a gram more weight. Now, this particular gun is unfortunately unfit for photography because it doesn't match any actual pattern of Colt revolver. We'll tell you why by the end of the episode, but just suspend your disbelief for a moment and understand that we're still dealing with a .44 caliber muzzle loading percussion cap single action only firearm, and enjoy the show. Before we get started, I'd like to again clarify that I can't really field questions about the value or authenticity of original Colts. For something like that, I suggest you contact a reputable seller with years of experience, hopefully one that's very handsome and likes us. Conveniently, there is one organization which has been extremely kind and helpful in producing content on historical firearms that is also very well versed in how to move these unique antiques around. Never hurts to check in on Rock Island Auction. Just a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, this episode picks up right after the last, and it won't make a lot of sense without having watched it first. Actually, our Reprocussion episodes have so far been tracing the history of Colt's revolvers right from the beginning. We started with the Patterson, which he attempted to market through the latter 1830s before his company failed. With the start of the Mexican-American War, Colt partnered with Samuel Walker to produce this massive .44 caliber 6-shot horse pistol, which he actually managed to sell to the US government. While intimidating, it really was too much gun and apparently too much powder. So for a second Army contract, Colt shortened up key components, especially in order to fit in a standard holster at the time and reduced weight. He also shortened the cylinder, limiting the possible powder charge to something the gun and the man behind it could survive. The Walker and the first contract of the improved holster model were mechanically the same despite the dimensional differences. They were also marked the same. An Indian and Ranger scene designed by Ormsby and roll engraved onto the cylinder. The guns were also marked USMR for the US Mounted Riflemen. By the second improved model contract, the third contract overall, the USMR had been replaced with the word US Dragoons. That's because this order was for the second Dragoons, which is where our revolver gets its common nickname, the Dragoon. When we left off, Colt had sold 1,000 Walkers, then 1,000 USMR improved holster pistols, and then 1,000 truly Dragoon Dragoons. There had been no mechanical changes, but on that last order, the cylinders were finally given a blued finish instead of being left in the white. Now, something that we did not get to cover last time was that sometime between 1848 and 1849, my sources disagree a little bit here, Samuel Colt was able to hire a talented man from his past, Elisha King Root. Born in May of 1808 in Belchertown, Massachusetts, like most rural American children, Root had worked through the warm months and attended school during the 4 winter months. Around age 10, he was employed as a bobbin boy. At age 15, he apprenticed to a machine shop in Ware. Completing his education, he served as a machinist at various factories until 1832, when he moved to Collinsville, where he would serve as the director and works manager of the Collins Axe Company. Samuel Colt knew that Root was a talented, honest, and dedicated man. Everything Colt was not. He offered Root a significant pay increase in order to secure this particular man as his superintendent. We'll hopefully see more of Root's influence on Colt in episodes to come. His involvement in today's episode was largely keeping things moving smoothly, and I mean moving literally, because at about the same time, late 1848 and lasting apparently for some months, Colt would move his manufacturing from Pearl Street to a newly completed factory building that was over on Grove Lane. He kept rent on both properties for a time so that the transition would not deeply interfere with his production lines. Once that was accomplished, Sam Colt went in search of more customers. His chief interest was Europe, which in 1848 had exploded into what would be known as the springtime of the peoples, the revolutions of 1848. Peasants and working class people rose up in protest, riot, or outright revolt. In Italy, France, Germany, Denmark, Schleswig, which was sort of both but not, Hungary, Galicia, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, Romania, Belgium, Ireland, Spain. There was also some unrest in South America, but that's not Europe. The reasons, efforts, and outcomes vary wildly, and we won't expand on them today. Suffice it to say, Samuel Colt smelled opportunity, especially in the small arms market. So he went to Europe in late 1849, where he filed fresh patents in England, Belgium, France, and Austria. To my knowledge, only the Austrian privilege was immediately successful. Colt had negotiated a 5-year royalty agreement with a man named Joseph Grauhol, owner of a machinery and textile plant. Grauhol wouldn't just clone the Dragoon, he actually shrank it considerably to nearly half its weight, reducing the bore to 9mm. It proved popular with officers, especially those of the Austrian Navy. And I'm gonna be honest, this is sounding really familiar if you know the future of Colt. The 1849 would be trialed by the Austrian Ministry of War, but they wanted it in a larger bore. Grauhol refused because it would make the revolver heavier and unpleasant. The officers liked it as it was. Now, while the bulk of Samuel's trip was meant to expand his own business, he did take time to further recoup costs by helping some other American businessmen as they dropped in on, well, Sultan Abdul-Majid I. While he didn't jump to rearm his officers with Colt's revolvers, he did apparently place an order for upwards of 200 pistols. More importantly, Sam managed to take a commission on helping to sell this Sultan 15,000 obsolete flintlock muskets and 2 warships. Now, despite his limited successes, Colt still felt like his travels in 1849 were on the whole a failure. It stuck out to him that Europe was still mired in aristocracy, and being an American commoner wasn't getting him very far in the various courts. There was, however, an apparent backdoor when it came to armaments. Military titles still carried weight and opened doors, which is why, once back home, he helped fund and support ex-Congressman Thomas Hart Seymour. This was for his run at the office of governor for the state of Connecticut. Seymour succeeded in 1850 and repaid his backer with the most precious gift, a commission of sorts. Under the recent Militia Act, the governor, serving as the captain general of the militia, had the authority to appoint 2 aides-de-camp to his personal staff, each with the rank of lieutenant colonel. By November, Sam Colt was granted one of those 2 titles. It's worth noting that when he later added it to his barrel markings, he left off the lieutenant part. Alright, we've covered a lot of ground on Colt the Man, but what about Colt the Revolver? Well, improvements were still being made. This patent granted in September of 1850 is quite revealing. However, only 2 changes were actually named in the text, and both had actually already been put into practice previously. These were changes to the cylinder stops and the addition of a safety mechanism. You know what, I might be able to use both of these guys to show you both points. Alright, here's our quote-unquote first model Dragoon, and here is... Well, actually, this thing's not really anything. It just embodies almost all the features we'll see in the Dragoon as we go. We'll talk more about this guy later in the episode. But it has what I want to show you in terms of differences. So let me set this aside and just talk to you about over travel for a second. The way that this gun is structured, it has what Colt would call a locking bolt, which means there's recesses here in the side of the cylinder, 6 of them. And as we bring the hammer back, a mechanism... Oh, there, it didn't even come all the way around. A mechanism clicks into one of those stops and aligns the chamber with the bore. Now, that's all well and good unless, as the mechanism wears or maybe was imperfectly fitted right from the factory, meaning, in other words, there's a narrow tolerance, a narrow margin of error, you can have the interaction between that bolt stop and this relief get a little bit outside the realm of what is essentially a tiny little pill-shaped hole, right? And that would mean that if you were shooting this gun in a hurry, so you're really, well, of course I'd actually have to do it in a hurry, wouldn't I, folks? If you're really whipping on that, right? Just powering through, you might actually get to the point where it didn't drop in the stop. Now this reproduction's in really good shape, so it did actually line up straight on the stop. But I've seen it on this and other guns. As a matter of fact, most recently I had to fix a situation like this on a Webley, in which the stop was not rising fast enough in order to catch the hole. Now, the way this was originally structured, the timing is so tight that you notice there's no real grind marks here. There's no sign of that stop dragging along the cylinder. It was supposed to pop straight into that hole. That's a bit ambitious for field use. Looking at an improved model, we see that there's now a squarish rectangular stop, and there's a scallop that precedes it. So that way our locking bolt can drop earlier and drag until it clicks into place, meaning it's less likely to miss the stop. Also, by the way, another thing that could theoretically happen in this system is that that same stop could have hit just on the outside and then bounced over. And so same problem is prevented. We hit, we have room for any sort of chattering, and then we drop in. So that means we get a more definite hard and speed-proof stop, nice and tight every time. I would like to have a worn revolver to show you that bypassing, but to be honest with you, I don't want to own one that does that. So you're just gonna have to trust me that it could do it, and that Colt solved the problem. Now, there's another feature on these guns that I want to show you, and that requires a little more explanation. All right, here is our reproduction Walker cylinder, and here is our reproduction Dragoon cylinder. Obvious difference in length, but what we're looking at is the back, because this is how they've been chosen to be reproduced by many a firm, which is that, okay, we have 6 firing cones or nipples. We have, of course, our ratchet teeth for rotating the gun, but you may notice on the Walker cylinder, we have exactly 1 little teat. Whereas on this one, we have 6 teats in total. That's fun to say fast. Now, here's the problem I have with this. These teats were subject to a patent of, I believe, 1850. And that is the first time they show up on paper, as far as I'm aware. And yet, looking at extant Walkers, I have seen at least 1 Walker that had exactly 1 teat. So it's likely that when they created these, they were copying from an original Walker, and that yes, the military Walkers probably had the teat. I'm not sure if all of them had it. I'm not sure when it was requested. There's no notes on when it appeared, and it wasn't patented until like 3 years later. And when it was patented, it was 6 in total. The other thing though, is that having looked at Dragoons as much as I can, usually from side shots because we don't unfortunately have the resources to go through a ton of early Dragoons, it seems like at least the early ones also tended to have 1 teat. However, I can't be 100% sure of that claim. As a matter of fact, the teat issue was so annoying for me to try to prove, we didn't even talk about it in the Walker because it wasn't subject to patent until much later, so that's why I'm bringing it up now. We saw these in our last episode. The way that they work is that you're able to lower the hammer onto the teat and therefore prevent it from being able to strike on any of the nipples. It also prevented rotation of the cylinder when the gun was at rest. So a handy and very simple little safety system. Now this is where I have to give a little ground to a very old notion of how the Dragoon pistols were organized. Collectors have long said that there are 3 models of Dragoon revolver. They also keep calling it the Dragoon Revolver, mind you. The first model is the original configuration, white cylinder, marked USMR, and with oval cylinder stops. Once the cylinder is blued and some small number are marked Dragoon instead of USMR, well, that might be the second model, but it's definitely the second model if it has the new cylinder stops, which appeared sometime in late 1849. See, this is already kind of falling apart, and it gets worse. Around serial number 10,000 or so, a new mainspring was installed, which we can actually see in the subsequent patent that we already mentioned. Instead of the Walker's V-spring, we now have a flat spring and a roller on the hammer. This was meant to smooth out the cocking motion. I might as well skip just a bit ahead while I'm making this point. The supposed third model is defined by its rounded trigger guard. They also generally have a bit more metal cut away at the loading area of the barrel assembly. There are some other changes to mention later, but I'll leave it here for now. All I'm really saying right now is there's a fairly hazy set of features that define and differentiate between models of Dragoon. Honestly, from my perspective, the Walker and all eventual versions are one continuous design. The later second model is perhaps the definitive Dragoon, at least in terms of being the most different mechanically from the Walker. I don't have a perfect second model, by the way. We do have an animator though, so let's get a look inside what one of those might actually be like.
We've already seen how to load the gun, and there's no great difference between the Dragoon and the Walker on this point. So, we'll start things off with the hammer resting on one of the 6 safety studs set between each of the chambers. These allow the Dragoon to be carried fully loaded with the hammer relaxed all the way down. Being a single action only revolver, we'll have to cock the hammer back manually, first clearing the half-cock position. Now the hammer's first and deepest notch rests over an extension off the trigger. In this position, the trigger cannot be pulled, but the cylinder is free to rotate. It's mostly used in safety loading or disassembling the revolver, but can also serve as a safety position. To actually fire the gun, we'll further cock back the hammer, and now the trigger rests against the second and much smaller notch on the hammer. Pulling the trigger releases the hammer, which strikes the percussion cap, igniting the powder. Attached directly to the hammer is the hand, which is biased forward by its own flat spring. This keeps in constant contact with the ratchet teeth of the cylinder. As we cock the hammer, the hand rises, rotating the cylinder before firing. As the hammer falls, the hand skips down the ratchet tooth of the cylinder, compressing its spring and then popping it back into place. This unusually shaped piece is the cylinder stop, also known as the locking bolt. This diagonally faced stud on the hammer serves as an interface between it and the stop. Cocking the hammer tips the stop down, freeing the cylinder to begin rotating. Once the stud clears the stop's extension, the stop's forward lug springs against the side of the cylinder wall. As one of the 6 cylinder recesses turns into the path of the stop, it pops in, locking the cylinder in alignment with the barrel. As the hammer drops, its stud slips under the stop's extension, compressing it laterally, and therefore keeping the cylinder locked until the hammer is cocked again. This wishbone-like combination spring features 2 tines. One keeps the cylinder stop pressed towards the cylinder, and the other keeps the trigger tipping back forward, and therefore its extension against the hammer. Now, all of this should seem familiar from our Walker episode. None of these mechanisms have changed, nor will they for quite some time. That is, of course, except for the mainspring. Instead of the Walker or early Dragoon V-spring, it's now a simple flat spring. And instead of pressing directly on the hammer, it's pressed against a wheel-shaped bearing. This roller smooths the operation of the hammer and prevents direct wear on it and the spring, the second mechanical innovation of the later Dragoon.
Now, it's going to be a moment before we get to live shooting, but that's okay because we have a lot more history to cover. Another contract would be let out in February of 1850. I haven't found a lot written on this one though, but it appears it was for another 1,000 units destined now for the 1st Dragoon Regiment. Now, mechanical changes, patents, and contracts wouldn't be the only exciting things for Samuel Colt in 1850. It would also be his first year of true competition from a design that actually had originated from his own factory. The story goes that 2 of his workers had been working on their own modification of the 1830s Jacquet revolver. They were attempting to circumvent Colt's patents. Having found out, Sam was furious and of course cast them out of his factory. These 2 men, Joshua Stevens and William Miller, then joined up with Edwin Wesson, who in turn had partnered with Daniel Levitt, holder of an 1837 patent for a break-action revolving pistol utilizing a beveled cylinder face so as to avoid chain fire. These men and some others would form the Massachusetts Arms Company in 1850. They began producing what became known as the Wesson-Levitt revolver, which attempted to avoid Colt's patent by using a unique gear arrangement to rotate the cylinder. The resulting pistol was lighter, simpler, and boasted that it could be made from existing pistol barrels and other components. It was also cheaper than the Colt. With the threat of actual competition looming, Samuel Colt was eager to make, well, more sales directly to the US government to really secure his role. So, still in 1850, Senator Rusk would successfully press for a resolution requiring the War Department to report on the opinions of officers and mounted troops on the efficiency of their repeating pistols, notably all of them being Colts. This report would further compare the Colt to other available pistols of the era. Now Brigadier General Talcott would convene a board for this purpose on November 6th. They gathered up letters of opinion from officers who had used the Colt revolving pistols. Those who had used exclusively the Walker were of mixed opinion. Ordnance officers in particular were unimpressed, but begrudgingly noted that the quality of the Colt pistols had steadily risen as more had been received into inventory. There was also some comparison with contemporary designs, most notably, that Wesson-Levitt. Sam was likely furious at this. Overall, the general opinion of the queried officers could be summed up by a statement from Colonel George W. Morgan. Colt's repeater is the most destructive and effective weapon that can be used in close quarters, and in the hands of the disciplined soldier, it requires no more care than the ordinary Dragoon pistol. that being a single-shot pistol, of course. Surprisingly, at the end of the trials, Talcott would recommend the Colt Revolver for general adoption, but only by trained officers and certain specialty troops. However, this didn't quite come to be. Colt's revolvers were superior, but they were also complicated and expensive, still costing the same as nearly 4 single-shot pistols. Colt's desired 5,000 unit bulk purchase just would not be sealed. Instead, the 4th contract for Dragoons, the next purchase from Colt's after this particular trial, totaled a mere 2,000 units. So I guess that's technically still a win. There was also a lot of talk around the need for a smaller belt pistol, lighter, and firing a smaller projectile. Curiously, we'll soon see Sam Colt introduce a new model. Another story, another day. While the US Army didn't exactly jump on the Levitt revolver, Sam Colt still couldn't allow any competition to get in the way of his profits. So, in 1851, he would put his attorney Edward Nicol Dickerson to work suing for patent infringement. While it's not exactly our topic today, it's worth saying that Samuel Colt not only managed to extend his earlier patent, but he also managed to expand it in court action to basically cover any rotating cylinder that also uses a locking system for aligning it with the bore as a very concept. In August of 1851, the Massachusetts Arms Company would be found guilty of infringement, and, as was common at the time, the court left the parties to sort out the damages. Dickerson negotiated a $15,000 payment and the cessation of their production. However, this didn't ultimately settle the matter. Mass Arms apparently continued to infringe, and the entire matter went to court again in 1852. This time, everyone played dirty, and the papers were filled with claims that Samuel Colt had bribed his way to success, especially with his patent reissue. Mass Arms attempted to prove prior art with various revolving mechanisms. However, Colt's attorney repeatedly pointed out how those pieces were suspiciously modified at some later date, and some of the parts appeared to have been falsely aged. Ultimately, the matter would again turn to Colt's favor, as the judge wisely pointed out that any fraud on Colt's part was a matter for another case or a criminal court. As the matter stood, Colt had the patent office agreed, and therefore Mass Arms was infringing. Fun fact, the only one to come forward and license from Colt would be Allen and Thurber, who apparently brokered a deal with Colt's lawyer while he was in Europe. Now you're thinking to yourself, man, Sam Colt just doesn't lose. He does lose, but then he just pushes harder and maybe lies a bit more. Well, he was a tenacious dude, and it paid dividends, let me tell you. But somewhere in that feverish, near-narcissistic state, he was also right. Not just about the value of his invention, not just about the need for machine manufacture and large scale, of course, but he was also apparently right that Talcott hadn't been playing fair. Winding back just a bit to the summer of 1851, the chief of ordnance and Colt's nemesis would take a stunning blow. It had been found out that he was playing favorites. This wasn't unusual, of course, and there were a lot of political strings that we would need to untangle in order to tell the story in detail, but it's only a side note again for our story today, so I'll summarize. Talcott had been ordering far too much cannon shot from a particular iron foundry in Richmond, of which he might have been something of an owner thereof, with his nephew serving as the manager. He would be relieved of his duties and court-martialed at the direction of the Secretary of War. He was reduced to the rank of colonel and appointed to command the Augusta Arsenal. Despite the controversy, Talcott was still a man with friends and connections, though. So Sam Colt was happy to hear from the man shortly after his humbling. Colt offered him a straight commission on any sales or contracts that he might negotiate for Sam Colt's pistols. Never waste an opportunity, folks. Now about now, I know what you are thinking. Why hasn't Othais hunkered down with the updated Dragoon? Well, that's because the gun I have here, a reproduction once more, is roughly what we'd call a third model in collector's terms. However, once again, some nuance was lost. So let's take a look and maybe I can explain. All right, here's our gun, and here's our older, more different gun. Now, this top guy actually bugs me, I'm going to be honest with you. This is an Uberti quote-unquote third-gen reproduction, and I think it fails horribly at being what it is, because its unique combination of features seems to be difficult to obtain, if not impossible, in the original construction of the pistols, but that's a matter for another time. What we're going to talk about now is that around serial number 10,500, the trigger guard shape starts to change. There's a transitional period, of course, but we go from this sort of square back or inverse curve back to a nice round plain trigger guard. And that tends to be the defining feature for collectors of what they would call a third model. In my eyes, that's a fairly minor change versus what else we've seen, like the differences in having a flat hammer with a roller on this guy versus a V-spring like the Walker on this guy. Now, other things that we may have that you see on this gun, just not to confuse you, by the time this changes, they would have still had the same lever plunger. But this particular gun annoys me because it has some scalloping in the recoil shield. It has proud studs. This is for a accessory we'll see in a moment. And by the time these things start to show up, we should not be seeing this. We should be seeing a linear winged plunger like you see on a Colt 1851, a gun we'll get to cover another day. We also, by the time you see these stock cuts, should have been seeing an iron back for the strap, which would have been actually a retrograde to the Walker era. Again, to get some reinforcement for an accessory that we're going to see in a moment. So, an imperfect system, but at this point, we've got square studs, we've got round trigger guard, we're probably looking at a roller hammer. This is what most people consider the final evolution of the holster-sized Dragoon revolver. Around number 13,000, we see the introduction of a Colt 1851-like flat-type loading lever latch. Ooh, say that 3 times fast. This was meant to be pinched from the sides. My revolver today doesn't have that addition. Now, just to be clear, there are some considerable overlaps in Colt features. I've personally seen a number of original Dragoons that sport old square-back trigger guards and yet have the updated latch. This is all, of course, further evidence that the 3-model classification system isn't really the best way to think of the ever-evolving Dragoon pistol. Now, with all that in mind, you can take our imperfect reproduction and put it in Mae's hands.
All right, half-cock, and I'll set it on the stand for y'all. Today, we're doing something different. Early paper cartridges. Just tear and spit. Pour in the pre-measured powder. In this case, I need to tear off a bit more. Delicious. Now I can squeeze out a pre-lubricated .44 caliber ball. From here, you know the drill. Lever it in there. If you're wondering why the second bite, these cartridges were based off of those for the old single-shot horse pistol. That gun could fit the extra paper as wadding, but the Colt's tolerances are too tight, and trying to keep the paper on makes a mess, in addition to risking poor seal and flashover. So, this is our best approximation. I'll let Othais cover the details for why. Once loaded, it's time to cap again. Nothing different here. Even the same safety position on the hammer. Let's just zip that up.
Ooh, that's much smoother. For anyone curious about those cartridges, they represent our best approximation of an early service cartridge for this revolver. When it comes to percussion revolver cartridge, most people think of the combustible type that you insert wholly into the chamber. But that was more of a Civil War era practice, and I've noticed particularly with the Dragoons and the later 1851 revolver, people seem to forget that they existed, well, long before that particular conflict broke out. I thought for our episode we should make a distinction. The cartridge we are attempting to duplicate was described in a letter in October of 1850. Written by then First Lieutenant James Gilchrist Benton from the San Antonio, Texas Ordnance Depot. Apparently, the troops were unhappy with the Colt flask, something we hinted at last time. The adjustable spout, well, it just wasn't throwing reliably similar charges, meaning your bullet's flight path would change radically between shots. That's not ideal. So instead, the boys in San Antonio began making their own paper cartridges. In the few trial cartridges that have been made, the round ball has been used, and they were made in the same fashion as the ordinary pistol cartridge. This would have been the then current single-shot percussion cavalry pistol. Scaling this round down to 44, we arrived at our estimation. There's actually some evidence of other tearaway paper cartridges for the Dragoon revolver, however we'll introduce these with Colt's next service pistol. And while we're discussing service, let's get back to Colt's sales. Despite Sam's various victories, he would never receive his 5,000 unit order for the Dragoon revolver. Instead, the 2,000 units of 1851/52 would be the largest single order. Sources vary a bit, but most agree. We'll see 2 more orders for roughly 1,000 units, a dip for just over 300, and 1 more rally in 1858, which I'll explain towards the end of this episode, and then it dives right off the cliff, thanks to the introduction of better models. Additional sales, however, would be made to individual state militias. Colt was aggressive with these markets, and thanks to federal allocations to the militia, plus his direct sales, some states would end up finding out post-Civil War that they had Dragoon revolvers still sitting in their packaging. There are actually a number of state markings out there, but it's a bit beyond our scope to explore them all today. Towards the very end of those government purchases, we do see some final changes to the Dragoon revolver, especially one I've already briefly mentioned. This guy is cut for shoulder stock. I'll be honest, I wasn't able to secure one of the reproductions of that particular accessory in the several years that I've actually owned this pistol. I know someone will now message me about having one, but bit too late there, guy. I had no way of knowing that you had it. Thankfully, we'll have another chance at a stocked black powder pistol further into our series. However, I do want to cover how a small number of Dragoon revolvers ended up kitted up in such a way. Well, it started with an attempt at combining features of the pistol and the carbine in order to reduce the cavalryman's pack load. Starting in 1853, a board of officers was convened to revise Army regulations and proposed increasing the caliber of the .44 Colt revolver, making the barrel longer and fitting it with a removable stock. Now Chief of Ordnance Craig directed Harper's Ferry Arsenal to create a stocked Colt revolver, which was apparently completed in December of 1853. That particular gun has been apparently lost, and the method of attachment with it. It did, however, go over well enough to warrant a request for, well, additional changes. So, larger bullet, longer barrel, and maybe 200 or 300 be made for trials. Our man Thornton wisely offered this would be a bad decision. The weight increase would make them useless as pistols, and they'd still be fairly poor carbines. Troops already disliked the size of the Dragoon and were favoring the newer 1851. When queried directly, Sam Colt also declined to make the thing. He knew it was a bad idea right from the start. The Army, however, was stuck on the idea of a larger bullet, and so went to work on a .58 caliber single-shot percussion pistol carbine, which was completed in August of 1855. These were interesting, and by 1857 reports were coming in that the stocks broke frequently in the field. Sam Colt might not have wanted to make a larger bored revolver, but he was curious about the stock. Initially, he just copied the Springfield pattern, but also found it too fragile. By 1858, he had worked out another design, one with the breech shield serving as a lug and the stock hooking underneath. With further work, he eventually refined and patented, well, the following. Yep, this is the method used on our reproduction, copied from a small number of originals, often fitted with longer barrels and barrel-mounted rear sights. There would actually also be a version that included a canteen in the stock itself, but that is a matter for another day. In February of 1858, an informal trial was conducted on the stocked revolver. 3 variations of Colt's revolving fixed stock carbines and one 7 1/2 inch barreled Colt Dragoon revolver with stock were tested. The latter was of course favored and recommended for adoption. The matter actually did progress, and several recommendations were made. The barrel should be 8 inches in length. Barrel-mounted sights should be fitted for 1, 2, and 300 yards. The swivels should be moved and consolidated. The brass grip strap should be replaced with iron or steel. The guns were to be issued in pairs with one stock between them. The soldier would wear one holstered on the saber belt and the other holstered on the saddle. The stock was also to be hung on the saddle. Then Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Charles A. Mae, famous for his charge at the Battle of Resaca, pushed hard for the purchase of 1,000 stocked Colts. He apparently wanted these for his troops bound for the Utah Territory, which at the time was an area of high tension. Now known as the Utah War of 1857-1858, this unusual conflict was one loosely fought between the Mormons and the U.S. Army. There were not any notable battles and very few skirmishes. Thanks to the pressure, Colt would see another contract though. 924 pistols, 462 stocks, priced at $50 for each set of 2 pistols and 1 stock. Deliveries, however, didn't begin until August and finished in December, meaning they sort of missed out on the sort of war. It is worth noting that in order to save production time, the 7 1/2 inch standard barrel was retained instead of making custom 8 inch barrels. My revolver right here obviously isn't a good approximation of the stock model. We have no barrel-mounted rear sight, we have a brass strap instead of an iron one. Not ideal. Anyway, the stock pistols were meant for companies D and H, plus a detachment from the 2nd Regiment of Dragoons. As we saw earlier, this would be the last of the large contracts for the Dragoon pistol, with the remainder being more ad hoc. I'm unsure if these were regular pistols or stocked models throughout. Now you may notice that the last of the Dragoons were purchased in 1860, and there is a good reason for that. The smaller bored Colt 1851 had been an excellent seller and obviously aided the success of the Dragoon models, but the bigger .44 caliber ball kept it selling up until the introduction of a better mousetrap, the model 1860, another Colt percussion gun, which we will get to feature in the future. Soon thereafter, the Dragoon was being called the Old Model Army, and it disappeared from the Colt price lists in 1863. By this time, the pistol alone, without accessories, was down to just $20 a piece. Service for the Colt Dragoon was fairly tame, at least during its heyday. It was there for the, of course, Indian Wars period of US expansion. We already mentioned it as part of the Utah expedition. More significantly, a small number were actually part of the Crimean War. Fought from 1853 to 1856, this conflict is more of a story for the Colt model of 1851, but a few Dragoons made it into Russian and British hands during the conflict. Colt's London factory, again a whole big story for another day, even produced a separate series of 3rd pattern Dragoons. Actually, a lot more like the one I have here today. Brass strap, rounded trigger, however, they did not have the cutaway for the stock. It's believed 700 were produced, all sold between 1853 and 1857 by most estimates. However, these must not have been big sellers because several hundred may have been returned to be sold in the US during the Civil War. And that conflict is generally the one people think of when they see the Dragoon, and while it was certainly present in the thousands for the fight, it wasn't close to the primary Colt sidearm, and it mostly inherited the accoutrement of its younger brother, the Model 1860, which again we'll discuss another day. I'm actually very sorry that I have to keep leaving these hanging threads in all these episodes, but the story of the Colt revolvers, especially these early models, are so interwoven with other elements, it's really difficult to keep everything separated out into succinct episodes. Hopefully I've done a good enough job shining a light on what might be the most unloved Colt percussion revolver though. When people think of the first Colt, they see the Patterson, of course. When they think of the big Colt, they imagine the Walker. When they think of successful Colts, they gotta think of the ubiquitous 1851. Commercially, the 1849 pocket pistol was the most successful though. The poor Dragoon, in all of its forms, is something of a transitional gun, and it's kind of hard to pin down and understand. Following the adoption of the Model 1860, this really became that old heavy other 44, and at that point, it had not really managed to define itself in such a way that it stood out. So I'm happy to have made these episodes, but it was with some difficulty because frankly, people don't think much about the Dragoon. Hopefully we've helped with that. And if not, well, you can still shed a little more time with us as we ask Mae for her opinion on the improved holster model. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And we have enough room for, well, another Dragoon.
Yeah, no one could have suspected another Dragoon.
It's more different than this one from earlier.
Not by much. I mean, the cylinder's not in the white.
Right, and there's some various manufacturing differences.
I mean...
Because they're two different makers.
Yeah, okay.
But, because they're both reproductions.
Visually, if you just kind of glance at them real quick, though, they look pretty much the same.
Right. This one's lever works the way it should work, unlike this one.
Yeah, I did like the lever on this one better.
Unfortunately, though, that's supposed to be modeled after a third pattern, so slightly different trigger guard. Whoop-de-doo.
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah. And then I think the hammer's different, too.
It's got a roller in the hammer and a flat spring. And then they kind of went weird. They went further into the third model, and they did the cuts for a shoulder stock that we don't have.
Yeah.
They did the proud screws for the shoulder stock that we don't have. Sorry, folks.
One day. One day would be nice.
But they didn't do the updated plunger because by then they had updated to this more linear plunger.
This one's a lot easier to use, I will say, but if I remember correctly, it doesn't want to stay up very easily.
This goes back to the Walker. We had this thing where historically this is supposed to be the worst about dropping its lever and ours didn't.
And then
that's supposed to be the best.
That one we probably shot 100 times, and I think we said this last time, and it has dropped maybe once.
Right. And that poor thing dropped.
Well, the thing is, like, we actually did shoot this more than once on range, and at first it was doing fine, but the moment that it went through, like, one cylinder, any sort of extra fouling, boom, it just was dropping every time.
Which doesn't make any sense. You'd think it would get dirtier and stick.
Right, because then the fouling would add extra friction, but no.
It shook itself loose and then it gave up. Like, I'd have to drive the pin, pull the spring, stretch it. So instead we went for the more economical zip tie.
Zip ties, they should have been around much longer. They did come in handy.
I don't know when the zip tie was invented.
I don't know.
But they could have used a piece of leather cord. But to be honest with you, as far as I know, there weren't that many problems with that originally.
Okay.
At least I didn't see it in the writing. But again, the Dragoon is so poorly written about.
Yeah. I mean, then again, we know that this probably is not made as nice as the originals were.
Maybe. The steel's much better.
Maybe softer springs?
I suspect softer springs, and like we talked about last time, the inertia factor of having a heavier piece of metal there versus what this is probably a very light piece of metal in there.
I could see that.
So, I'm going to guess that you didn't notice much difference in shooting.
Not really. The only thing that was demonstrably different, and it was actually activating the hammer on this guy, pulling it back. It was much lighter. It felt smoother. I think I only had one tie-up, and that was because I want to say there was just a little cap that got stuck in between the cylinder and the actual wall of I guess it was just the frame.
So now we get into the unfair comparison category, though.
Yeah, how so?
Because we have early Walker with its V-spring and no roller on the hammer. We have the early Dragoon, which has V-spring, no roller on the hammer.
Right.
And if you just had this and that, you would say the roller was amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Because you couldn't reliably do this.
Correct. That was more difficult as I went on, whereas this one, like nothing.
But since you could do it on the Walker, which structurally is the same as this guy.
The Walker had the extra weight, though. I was using that weight of the Walker to my advantage to help cock it.
This one's also just lighter sprung. I'm sorry. It
does feel
it's a
lighter,
manufacturer thing. So, between these two, is one lighter than the other. You want to try?
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
All right.
So then try this guy. Uh-oh.
Oh, the Walker is lighter.
And yet it doesn't have the roller.
It's a little bit lighter. Oh my God, that's weird.
Right, so it turns out...
I'm not using the weight. I tried to make sure I maintained it this height the same for the angle and everything.
I suspect we're going to find is that the roller allows you to get away with a heavier spring without beating up the shooter as much. And you're not getting that drag along the spring as much. So in theory, if these both had the same poundage on the spring, this should be lighter to operate. But because we're in reproduction land and nothing is consistent...
Nothing can be consistent in repro.
Because these are all 3 different manufacturers, I'm sure.
This was still much nicer. I still liked it.
It's
a smaller version of the Walker. It's got a nice light hammer by comparison to the earlier Dragoon that we shot. And on top of that, aside from lever drop, which fixing with a zip tie, which again can't hold it. It could just be this repro causing that issue.
Right.
I think it's pretty good. Also, I have the addition to have potentially shoulder tuck with this one. I don't see the Walker having those extra little bits to attach to.
I'm be awesome. I'm gonna be awesome. I'm gonna be
You're gonna be awesome. Okay.
Yes, I'm very awesome, but I'm gonna be honest here. This episode has broken me for trying to organize anything because I was like, okay, I'll just get like a Dragoon and we'll talk about it.
Right.
And we had that one.
Yeah.
So I was like, done. So I started doing my research. I'm like, oh my God, this thing doesn't make any sense.
Right.
It's not, there might be a Dragoon that existed that looks like this one, but probably not. Because it looks like by the time you have the shoulder stock accessories, you should have the different latch.
Oh, yeah.
And then the other thing is this has a brass backstrap. The ones that were fitted for the shoulder stock should have had an iron backstrap.
Oh.
Right.
So is this a mix master?
So in other words, this thing, which is probably the most common one you would see out there if you were to buy one,
isn't even...
It's an anachronism. It doesn't make any sense.
Oh, wow. That
And
sucks.
then I started looking around and I can't find any that...
have the iron... and the change of this lever.
Yeah, I can't find any combination that would get me a late one quite right, except for I have seen a couple repros that have barrel-mounted sights, long barrels, and the shield. I just don't know if they had the backstraps in brass or iron, but you could at least paint them black.
I guess, yeah.
But then they won't ever have the correct barrel latch.
Right.
But I did see one with the correct barrel latch, but otherwise it was like a first or second series.
So no shoulder stock
and that it
attachment.
had like the square back trigger guard and no shoulder stock.
No.
And I'm going, and I think they're made from different manufacturers, so I don't even know if I went around spending $400 on each of them. If I spent $1,000, could I put together a reasonable reproduction of one of these things from a late series?
You'd have to hand fit it, I bet.
If anybody has what they think is an adequate third model stocked version
that
to
meets
share
all
with
the
us,
things all the lists that he just ticked down.
I would love to see it, but really the big disappointment for me is realizing how wrong the reproduction market got it. And the problem is that decision was probably made 50 years ago.
So the thing is, like, what research did they have to go on to get it right? You've been having to piece it together as is, and it's still been a nightmare.
It probably started with an extant example, and then when they found out there were features they wanted, like the stock, they just added those cuts necessary to do that, because why would you make 2 entirely different means of locking the lever, right? Because that's not economical, and nobody in the market for buying the repros really cared at that point.
Right.
But for me, later on, trying to be like, can I get one that has like
all the features that I need to show?
All the early features and one that has all the late features? And it's just like, and the weirder thing is for especially the Colt Gen 2s, I believe. No, is it them or the Birdies? I can't remember. I think it's the Colt Gen 2s. Gen 2 Colts. They had the ability to find like, you could find a round stop version versus a scallop stop. You could do that because they had what they called Gen 1, 2, and 3. But what they thought were Gen 1, 2, and 3 had no bearing on anything. I think their Gen 1s even had the Walker-style V-spring because they were making Walkers so they could get away with that, right?
Oh, wow, yeah.
But, you know, just looking at all the different brands, it's nuts. And it gets even weirder because I'm already looking into the pocket pistols. The repros are nuts.
So finding one of those is going to be difficult.
Yes.
Okay.
So this episode really, like, when we shoot this, we're sort of just shooting it for the mechanism change. And that's about as far as we can really get it. I'd like to do an assessment of the sort of stocked cavalry pistol. But
right. It's going to be hard to come across.
I think we could do like a mini episode as an addendum to this if anybody's got one that they can loan us. So we'll see. Cool. But it would have to be the right stack. Is the other problem. So,
yeah. But certainly would be a unique experience. I'm sorry that you've been having to go through all that.
Well, at least materially, this is a different revolver from this one.
And it gave me a good perspective on what to potentially expect.
Right. Although I will still say the iterations, the changes, still well within what people would call like a Mark I, Mark II of a normal pistol.
Sure.
So it's hard for me to imagine that either of the Dragoons are not Walkers. I think these are all the same pistol in my mind.
Yeah, in my mind too. They're really not so drastically different that I would classify them otherwise.
Yeah, a reduced powder load and a reduced barrel length. And that's
about it.
Really about it, plus some mechanical changes over time. But now we're creeping into, let's say, 1850s.
Right.
Are you still excited about this revolver? Because by this time, and I know we haven't covered it for the show, but you could have started to, like, by the time the third models are around, the Colt 1851 36 caliber is available, that nice handy little thing.
That is pretty handy.
The Adams patent, like, double actions have appeared.
Yeah, those have come around.
The Tranters are starting to appear.
Do you know when pepper boxes are coming?
The pepper boxes are definitely now
around,
well in the market, the one that people are thinking about. So is the Dragoon still holding ground? Because we even saw Colt start to take on a competitor. There was a competitor to Colt with a mechanical action in this episode. So what do you think? Do you think the Dragoon is still the obvious choice, or do you think the competition is starting to make you feel a little less trustworthy about it?
You know, I really haven't actually gotten to shoot a lot of the quote-unquote competitors for this one. I'd like to be able to try them out. But that being said, if there's a double action option coming out, that'd be pretty rad. So I'd like to see how the Adams further develops realistically.
Right. Yeah, early Adams and Tranters are very curious to me.
Going from single action to having double action options, that's a whole new ballpark there.
Yeah, I agree. I would really, the originals...
That would instantly blow this out of the water, by the way.
Oh, yeah. The originals would be DAO, so no single action at all.
Okay.
But...
That'd be fine.
Yeah.
That would even be preferred over just single action only.
Yeah, you very quickly see some mechanisms come into play that I'm very curious about. And then after that, you start to see hammer blocks and stuff, and it's all sort of intermingling with what Colt's doing. As a matter of fact, I have some theories about the Colt 1851. We'll get to cover that episode soon.
Right.
And I don't really have a way to prove it out, but it's very interesting that, like, 2-3 years before the Colt 1851, there's already an Austrian 9mm 36 caliber, like there's already an Austrian small frame pistol that comes up very close to the size of what would be the 1851, developed by someone else who had taken the Dragoon and shrunk it down.
Was that in 36 too?
It was supposedly a 9mm. I haven't got my hands on one, but it's supposed to have been a 9mm, which would have been right on there with a 38.
Yeah,
not
30,
bad. 30, yeah. So I'm very curious how much Colt might have been inspired by his own licensee in that regard. But there's probably no proof in that. He'd never have said it if he was.
No, of course
I
not.
just thought of it myself. F you. So
anyone that says otherwise, get out.
But mechanically, it's there. I think by the time we get the third model, we're really seeing a new revolver. We're seeing what's going to be what I consider to be the core of how Colts tend to work for a while. And they certainly seems rugged enough for what it's doing, although there's obviously room for improvement.
Yeah. Now, there is one major difference we haven't talked about between this and the shoots from the previous revolvers.
That's right, because on the previous gun, we used this.
Yes, the wonderful change-up of the flask that we absolutely loved. No, we hated that.
Now, what flask did you use for this episode?
None whatsoever. This was the fun paper cartridge route.
Right. Suze actually made those for us. Thank you, Suze. We sicked her on it based off of, well, I already said it in the episode, but letters at the time. There's a number of ways we could have made paper cartridges. It depends on when we pick the year. But we wanted to go for sort of the OG. Like, we want to go for, like, the first one we could find.
Right.
And to be honest with you, I have no idea if we got it right or not.
I don't either, but it was a different experience. I'll give it that regardless.
From the letters, we know it must have been a tearaway and plop. Okay, we know that much. But also, generally, it's more in line with the single-shot pistols to have, like, a tearaway pour and then just, like, shove that thing in there and rod it. But because this is so straight-walled out of the chamber, we can't just throw extra paper. We need the diameter. And also, those pistols have no risk of chain detonation.
Right, whereas these do.
Right, we want to have a nice fit. So if we're trying to fit paper, it's got to go under the ball or it's going to get completely torn away while we're packing. Right. If it creates a cavity, it's going to risk a chain fire. So we did the best interpretation of what the heck that letter meant. I've noticed a lot of people don't spell out the details back then.
No.
They say something that's like a 12-step process.
Honestly, it's just probably passed on by word of mouth and experience from learning from the guy next to you.
Or it just wasn't, the resolution wasn't that necessary for the letter. Yeah. Or it's just like, he said, yeah, we made them basically the way we made the pistol. He didn't think he needed to clarify, by the way, because it's straight wall.
Well, no, because everyone's just doing it around him. Why would he need to clarify something that's as simple as they breathe air?
Right, or those guys over there are sorted out for themselves. There's a much more sort of immediately crafty society, and so you don't see people defining in detail what the heck they're doing. They just sort of say a one-sentence thing to represent a bunch of process. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, you don't go through the whole process of saying how you drove the car to the supermarket. You went, I drove to the supermarket.
Right.
That's it.
What does that mean? What car did he drive?
Right.
How did he drive it? Was it
manual stick? Like, what are we talking about?
So, we did the best we could.
Right.
So I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, how do you know that? And it's like, we don't know it. We did as close as we could, but I'm going to be honest with you. A lot of the stuff I see people doing, they don't know it either. Because whenever I try going for a primary source, it turns out that they were taught that way from the guy who taught that way. And it's some sort of word of mouth thing almost. Mm-hmm. So we got as close as we thought we could for the first introduction of a paper cartridge.
Yep.
By the time we get into like the 1851, which was much more standard all the way up until Civil War, we can really start to talk about what people think of as paper cartridges that actually go in and ignite in the gun. But I think it was a bit premature to do them. The ignition style ones were available for these by the Civil War, but they really designed for the other guns, so we just left them out.
Yeah.
How'd you feel about using those? Because you've never had to do that with like a handgun. You've had, on rare occasion, somebody will hand her a true muzzle loading like musket or something.
On a rare occasion.
And you've had to do it before. Mm-hmm. But what was it like having to do like 6 in a row to get the gun ready?
Well, I know what Pyrodex tastes like, so that's a different
it's kind of
candy
salty
flavor.
And tart.
It is very tart, I will say that. I didn't expect it to quite be as tart as it was. For some reason, it smells sweeter than it tastes.
It's like Crave candy. You remember that back in the 90s?
I never had Crave candy. What is Crave candy?
Oh, it was burning holes in stomachs. That stuff was awful.
I had warheads.
Anyway, so
it was not like a warhead. I'm going to go with that.
Other than the flavor.
And the texture.
Okay.
Yeah,
you're like licking your... I'm watching you lick your
just because I just distinctly remember how hard it was to get out of my mouth. Like, I remember spitting off to the side and being like, it's still there. I can't get it out. It's like it's melded to my tongue. It made my tongue a little numb.
In a firefight, would you care?
No, I wouldn't give a shit. I'd be like, tear that bitch off. Pour it in. I want to get done. And I found myself having difficulty pouring. And you even told me on range, you're like, try to tear at an angle. I found that easier. And I kept trying to tear at an angle, but somehow it wanted to tear straight across. And I'd just be like, damn it. And I would just be like, all right, well, pour it in. Try to get it even. And even then, I still like managed to miss the cylinder a little bit here and there.
Those versus this.
Oh, I think I'd argue the paper cartridge route is probably faster.
I like it better than even a good flask.
Really?
Yeah, because think about what you got to keep track of.
Oh, a giant flask. Yeah, that's true.
No, it's not just a flask, because the flask is bolted to you. But the flask, let's say you have some, oh boy, now it's going to get stuck in there. Oh, wow. See, that's the problem.
What'd you do?
I pulled out some ball ammo, right?
Okay.
So we've got the...
He dropped his balls.
Let's assume the flask is really good. We've got ball ammo loose, flask loose, gun loose.
Yeah.
I guess stick this in and you might have a pouch and everything so that you can just pull it from the pouch and put it in there and everything. But it's more hand motions to go for the pouch every time and work out of the pouch. Yeah, hold on, let me put my balls away.
Okay, thank you.
So,
it's more appropriate.
I just feel like the motion of like tear, pour, it's pre-measured.
You ploop out the little ball that's already in there too.
Right. Now, in theory, if it had been a pistol, we would have just shoved all that in there, and that's really fast.
Right.
But for us, it was like, we gotta do something with all this paper. So we just tore again and blooped it out. Right. But the difference between going pour and a herp ploop versus pour, put the flask away, pick up the ball,
throw it in there. Yeah, no, that was, if you make that comparison, yeah, absolutely. The paper cartridge is supreme. Now,
not only that, you could keep the ball greased. And then it's not a bag of greased balls that you're reaching in there and they're not, you know what I mean? Like,
now,
it's
I'll
all
give
the
you a
grease is at the bottom.
scenario. Which one would you rather do while it's raining on you?
I'd probably still go with the paper cartridge.
But the paper cartridge is going to get wet, and then you got wet powder.
Only for, I mean, you don't have to be really, think about it. The raindrops don't just saturate everything.
Oh, I think I did see someone do a video where they were soaking a gun or soaking a percussion revolver in a bunch of water to see if it would still go off.
No, it's probably Carl, but that was also, but that would have been already loaded.
Okay.
We're talking about loading the gun.
Yes.
The problem with that you're going to have is if you tried it, so here's the downside for the rain for you. Mm-hmm. You have to hold once you pour the powder, you have to hold the gun upright, right?
Yeah, so now you have to
now the powder is exposed to rain,
no matter what, yeah.
So you would want to be able to pour that powder in there, covering it up with your hand, and immediately bloop the ball in there.
Yeah.
If you do it with the flask and everything,
it is more covered with the paper cartridge.
Right.
You're not. I'm thinking like if the paper cartridge got like soaked versus if the.
No, why would it get soaked? It's in your pouch. You take it out of the pouch. It's good. It would have to get hit precisely by several raindrops while it's moving.
And pull out the cartridge, hold it out to the rain,
you're wet,
and let it get wet.
But if you just hold a little paper cartridge out, the likelihood of raindrops hitting it.
It'd have to be a downpour. Yeah. Downpour. Yeah.
And then you got problems anyway.
Yeah, that's true. You got bigger problems.
No, I'd take it in the rain too.
That's fair. Okay, yeah, I could see that.
Okay.
All right. Well, I was curious. We hadn't talked about that scenario.
But anyway, okay. So you know my opinion. Which do you still prefer?
After we've talked about the scenario that I was thinking on that hadn't fleshed out yet, then yeah, I would take the paper cartridge over, especially that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even off of a good flask, I'd take the paper cartridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all there. It's all contained. It's effectively moving to the next step, which is the cartridge all in one.
If there was any sort of reasonable funneling effect
that you could have,
I would also like it for a bullet. But the problem is with the bullet in the paper cartridge is that it's you'd have to heal the bullet just right to get the thing to line up, which is also possible, but I didn't find reference that exists. I didn't find reference to it according to the Dragoon. Well, Dragoons. Yeah. So I didn't
There's a Walker on the table. See how easy it is to confuse them?
But I didn't find it in reference specifically to the Dragoon. By the time I see the bulleted paper cartridge, I did not see it until after these guys were already being replaced by other things.
Okay. So we wanted to go with as early as possible reference to the cartridge information that you found. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we've sort of snugged ourselves into this gap. I'm sorry if it seems weird that I'm trying to avoid overlapping the Civil War too much, but I really want to remind people there's a decade plus
before
that exists.
That. Yeah.
And it's kind of been forgotten, and it's a developmental period in which a lot of things happen. It won't make a lot of sense now, but one day we'll get to talk about the atoms.
Yeah.
And things like that, and you'll suddenly go, oh, wow, like a lot was happening. 1850 to 1860, a lot happened.
Yeah.
And so people tend to forget about it. We always think about the Civil War as this thing in which all this technology showed up.
And it's like, no. It all existed prior to it. It's just it was further fleshed out and more readily available in the Civil War.
Look at our World War I series. Almost everything that's used in the war was invented before the war. 1890s to 1910 tends to be where everything's happening.
Some of it from World War I even overlapped into World War II.
Yeah. And so you've got to imagine the decade before the Civil War, there's a lot of stuff that's getting invented that then gets rolled into that conflict and finally proven. So keep an eye out. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
All right. How do you feel about the Dragoon now that we got through the whole thing?
I feel pretty excited. I like the change up in the cartridge. I'd like to see where it's going with that for next time around. Is that going to be much different? Should we expect a lot of differledifferences there?
I don't know. I'm not that deep.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I'm thinking about taking a detour for the pocket pistols, which is probably not a cartridge world. At least not the way I would report.
Do I get to go back to my dope flask? I like the other flask.
We're having problems there because, once again, I want to point out this is if you like Reprocussion, make sure that you A, tell us you like Reprocussion.
Yeah.
B, anybody that might get mentioned on Reprocussion that was involved in it, go thank them.
Yes, please do.
And really drive that home because this is very slow to make and it's very difficult to make. So if it's not worth your entertainment, we can go do 2 other episodes probably.
Right. And he, honestly, the amount of research he has to go and delve into that, to parse it out, to figure it out what the actual storyline is.
I come out feeling like I don't know as much afterwards. I'm
and
like, oh God.
Almost every film day results in nearly 2 film sessions. So it is quite a lot of work, and we want to make sure we're getting this right too. We never half-ass this, y'all know it.
Yep. All right. With that, I'd just like to remind you from last episode, when I'm talking about people that worked with us, Rock Island, obviously.
Yep.
They're right at the front. But also, for this and some upcoming ones, Arizgon Bullet Molds have been extremely responsive to us. They are very dedicated to getting it right. So check them out. Their product goes fast. You need to sign up for their email list if you want to get molds. But I highly recommend them. And then otherwise, you guys just have a good one.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
And there's like some gunsmith had added a little micro hand. You know how the Colt 1878s have a double hand? Mm-hmm. I'd actually like to show this on the live stream. Some gunsmith had it before. They added a little tiny third hand on the hand. It's like, yo, dog, I heard you like hands.
It's like little tiny fingers
sticking up over the top so that it can't lock up correctly. And I'm scared to cut that off because one of the neighbor's daughters found it later.
Yeah.
Well, half of it. She's like, they were in our backyard and I heard her go, "Ooh, there's a turtle." Oh, there was a turtle.
God, the savages.
All right, they've gone in. She's making a... she's wincing and coughing and frowning. That's not a good sign. She's making a terrible face.
Oh, it is like corn.
What does that mean?